December in western Wisconsin comes with a particular kind of cold, the type that turns breath to frost and makes fresh snow squeak underfoot. On the evening of December 31st, 1985, in the small town of St. Croix Falls, population barely 2,000, Yvonne Minke kissed her 4 children goodnight and told them she'd be back soon. The 35-year-old mother was heading to a New Year's Eve party just a few blocks away, wearing jeans, a winter coat, and boots that would leave distinct impressions in the snow. She never made it home. What her children found instead, early the next morning, would shatter their family forever. For 39 years, the case remained unsolved, filed away in boxes that gathered dust in the Polk County Sheriff's Office. Then investigators discovered something that changed everything. The killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, and she was someone no one had suspected. St. Croix Falls sits in the northwestern corner of Wisconsin, perched along the St. Croix River that forms the boundary with Minnesota. In 1985, it was the kind of place where high school football games drew half the town, where the local diner knew everyone's usual order, and where leaving doors unlocked wasn't just common, it was expected. The population hovered around 2,000 residents, most of whom had lived there for generations. Family names repeated throughout the decades. The same surnames appeared on business storefronts, church directories, and cemetery headstones. The winter of 1985 had arrived early and stayed late. By mid-December, snow had already accumulated to depths that made the landscape look like a Christmas card. The cold was the dry, brittle kind that made car engines reluctant to turn over and forced residents to plug in engine block heaters overnight. But the people of St. Croix Falls were accustomed to harsh winters. They had snow tires, insulated boots, and a practiced efficiency in clearing driveways before heading to work. Life moved at a deliberate pace. The paper mill provided employment for many families. Others worked in small businesses along the main street or commuted to larger towns for work. Entertainment consisted of high school sports, church socials, and gatherings at each other's homes. When someone threw a party, word spread quickly through informal networks of phone calls and chance encounters at the grocery store. This was the world Yvonne Minke inhabited in December 1985. It was a world that felt safe, predictable, and insulated from the kind of violence that made headlines in cities. What happened to her would shatter that illusion forever. Yvonne's life. Yvonne Marie Minke was born in 1950, the eldest of 3 siblings in a working-class family with deep roots in Polk County. Those who knew her from childhood described a girl who was responsible beyond her years, the kind of daughter who helped with younger siblings without being asked, and who took school seriously even when friends treated it casually. She married young, as was common in that era and place, and by her mid-20s had 4 children. The marriage didn't last. By the early 1980s, Yvonne found herself navigating single motherhood in a community where 2-parent households were the overwhelming norm. It wasn't easy. She worked various jobs to support her family, including shifts at local businesses that required her to be on her feet for hours. Money was always tight, but Yvonne had a gift for stretching a dollar and making her children feel secure even when finances were precarious. Her children ranged in age from early elementary school to early teens by 1985. Neighbors recalled seeing Yvonne at school functions, always present despite her work schedule. She attended parent-teacher conferences, chaperoned field trips, and made sure her kids had what they needed for school even if it meant she went without. One teacher later described her as the kind of mother who apologized for things that weren't her fault and thanked you for doing your job. Yvonne wasn't outgoing in the way some people are. She didn't seek attention or dominate conversations, but she was warm with those she trusted, quick to laugh at a good joke, and fiercely protective of her children. Friends described her as someone who listened more than she spoke, who remembered birthdays and asked follow-up questions about problems you'd mentioned weeks earlier. By late 1985, Yvonne had been seeing Jack Owen, a local man who was known around town, but not particularly remarkable. Owen worked in construction and maintenance, the kind of steady, if unspectacular employment that characterized many men in St. Croix Falls. Their relationship was casual, or at least that's how it appeared to outsiders. They weren't engaged, didn't live together, and didn't make grand public displays of affection. But they spent time together, and Yvonne's children knew him as someone who came around occasionally. What Yvonne may not have fully understood was that Jack Owen's romantic life was more complicated than it appeared. He was also involved with Mary Jo Bailey, a relationship that predated his involvement with Yvonne and had never fully ended. In small towns, these kinds of arrangements rarely stay secret for long, but they can persist in a gray area of ambiguity, with all parties aware of the situation but no one forcing a resolution. This was the situation as 1985 drew to a close. Yvonne Menke, a 35-year-old single mother of 4, in a relationship with a man who was simultaneously involved with another woman, in a town small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but large enough that people could maintain separate social circles. It was a situation that might have resolved itself peacefully, with someone eventually choosing to walk away or with all parties agreeing to move on. Instead, it would end in violence on the last night of the year. December 31st, 1985, the day. The morning of December 31st dawned gray and cold, with temperatures struggling to reach 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Yvonne spent the day at home with her children, a typical routine for a holiday when most businesses were closed. She prepared meals, tidied the house, and made sure her kids were occupied and content. At some point during the day, she received word about Jack Owen's New Year's Eve party. It was to be a casual gathering at his house on Washington Street, just a handful of blocks from where Yvonne lived. Owen's home was modest, a small single-story structure typical of working-class neighborhoods in St. Croix Falls. It had a living room that could accommodate a dozen people if they didn't mind being cozy, a kitchen where drinks and snacks could be laid out, and a television that would broadcast the New Year's countdown from Times Square. Yvonne decided to attend. It was a chance to get out of the house, to celebrate with other adults, to mark the transition from one year to the next in a town where such occasions were excuses for socializing. She told her children she would go for a while, but wouldn't stay late. They were old enough to be left alone for a few hours, responsible enough to look after each other, and follow the rules she'd established about staying inside and not answering the door for strangers. As evening approached, Yvonne got ready. She dressed practically for the weather. Jeans, a winter coat that was warm but not bulky, and insulated boots with treads designed for walking on snow and ice. She didn't overdress for the occasion because this wasn't that kind of party. It was neighbors gathering, not a formal celebration. She left her home sometime after 8 p.m., walking the short distance to Owen's house. The streets were quiet, as they always were in St. Croix Falls after dark in winter. Most people were inside, where it was warm. The few cars that passed moved slowly, mindful of ice that could form on roads even when they looked clear. Yvonne arrived at the party to find a familiar scene. People she knew from around town, holding drinks and talking in small clusters. The television was on in the background, showing pre-recorded festivities from cities that seemed impossibly distant from this Wisconsin town. Someone had put out snacks, chips, dip, cookies that might have been homemade or store-bought. It was modest but sufficient, the kind of gathering that required no pretense. Yvonne talked with other guests, accepted a drink, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of the evening. Several witnesses would later recall seeing her there, though none could pinpoint exactly when she arrived or remember specific conversations. That was the nature of such gatherings. People came and went, conversations flowed from one topic to another, and unless something unusual happened, individual moments didn't lodge in memory. What is known is that Yvonne did not stay until midnight. At some point, estimates ranged from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m., she decided to leave. She may have wanted to get home to her children before the clock struck 12. She may have felt tired or uncomfortable. She may have had any number of unremarkable reasons for leaving a party that wasn't particularly exciting or memorable. She said good night to those nearby, retrieved her coat, and stepped out into the cold. The temperature had dropped further as the night deepened, and fresh snow had begun falling lightly, adding to the several inches already on the ground. The streets were empty now. Anyone who was going to a party had already arrived. Anyone staying home was settled in for the night. Yvonne began the short walk home, a route she had traveled countless times. From Jack Owen's house on Washington Street, she would have walked east toward Adams Street, then turned toward her own neighborhood. The total distance was less than half a mile, perhaps a 10-minute walk under normal conditions. She never completed that walk. The discovery of violence. January 1st, 1986, arrived with the muted quality that follows celebration. St. Croix Falls woke to hangovers, leftover snacks, and the realization that it was a new year, but life looked much the same. For most residents, it was a day to recover, to take down decorations, and to prepare for the return to work routines. For Yvonne Menke's children, it was the day their world collapsed. When they woke that morning and found their mother hadn't returned, their initial reaction was likely confusion rather than panic. She had said she'd be back, but perhaps she'd stayed later than planned. Perhaps she'd decided to sleep at a friend's house rather than walk home in the cold. Children in that era, especially in small towns, were accustomed to a level of independence and adult autonomy that might seem unusual today. But as morning stretched toward afternoon without any word, confusion turned to concern. They began calling family members and friends, asking if anyone had seen their mother or knew where she might be. The calls created ripples of worry that spread through the community's informal networks. Someone, records differ on exactly who, went to Jack Owen's house to ask if he'd seen Yvonne. He confirmed she'd been at the party but had left before midnight. He hadn't walked her home. She'd left on her own. He assumed she'd made it back without incident. Family members began searching the route between Owen's house and Yvonne's home, walking the streets and calling her name. It was during this search that someone spotted something dark against the white snow near the intersection of Washington and Adams Streets, less than 2 blocks from where the party had been held. At first, from a distance, it might have looked like discarded garbage or a pile of clothing someone had dropped. But as they drew closer, the horrible truth became clear. It was a person, lying face down in the snow, motionless. It was Yvonne. The Polk County Sheriff's Office received the call at approximately 1:30 p.m. on January 1st, 1986. Deputies arrived within minutes to find what was unmistakably a crime scene. Yvonne's body lay in the snow approximately 15 feet from the edge of the street, as if she had collapsed or been pushed while walking on the sidewalk. She was face down, her arms at her sides, her winter coat still buttoned. The responding officers secured the area immediately, establishing a perimeter and calling for additional resources. In a town the size of St. Croix Falls, a homicide was an extraordinary event. The sheriff's office had to mobilize deputies from across the county, call in investigators from larger jurisdictions, and coordinate what would become the most intensive criminal investigation Polk County had seen in years. The initial examination of the scene revealed several critical details. First, there were no signs of struggle in the immediate area. The snow around Yvonne's body was largely undisturbed except for the impressions made by her fall and subsequent coverage by snow that had continued falling through the night. Second, there were boot prints in the snow, leading from the direction of the street toward where Yvonne lay, then back toward the street. The prints were photographed and measured, though the technology of 1985 limited how much information could be extracted from them. Third, and most critically, there was blood. Not a large amount, but visible dark stains on the snow near Yvonne's upper body. When investigators carefully turned her over, they found 2 bullet wounds in her back, both in the upper torso. She had been shot from behind at close range, so close that powder burns were visible on her coat. The medical examiner who arrived later that afternoon confirmed what investigators already suspected. Yvonne had died from gunshot wounds, likely within seconds or minutes of being shot. The bullets had entered her back and traveled through vital organs. Death would have been quick, but that small mercy did nothing to diminish the horror of what had happened. Yvonne Menke had walked away from a party, heading home to her children, and someone had shot her in the back on a public street. The killer had then left her body in the snow and walked away, seemingly confident that they wouldn't be caught. The investigation begins. By the evening of January 1st, the Polk County Sheriff's Office had established a command center at their headquarters and begun the methodical work of building a murder investigation. Led Detective James Keller, a veteran investigator with 20 years' experience, was assigned to head the case. Keller had worked homicides before, but most had been domestic situations or bar fights where the perpetrator was obvious and usually present at the scene. This was different, a calculated killing with no immediate suspect and no apparent witnesses. The first priority was establishing a timeline. When had Yvonne left the party? Who had seen her leave? Had anyone been walking in the area around that time? The investigators began interviewing everyone who had attended Jack Owen's party, a process that would continue for days as they tracked down guests and took detailed statements. The accounts were frustratingly vague. People remembered Yvonne being at the party but couldn't agree on when she'd arrived or left. Some thought she'd stayed until around 10:30 p.m. Others recalled seeing her later. Several guests admitted they'd been drinking and couldn't be certain about times. This was before the era of smartphones with precise timestamps, before surveillance cameras on every corner. Time was marked by television broadcasts, by clocks on walls, and by the imprecise memory of people focused on celebration rather than observation. What became clear was that Yvonne had left alone. No one recalled seeing her leave with another person. She had said goodnight and walked out into the night by herself. Investigators also interviewed Yvonne's children, a heartbreaking process. The oldest, barely a teenager, tried to be helpful but could only confirm that their mother had left home around 8 p.m. and hadn't returned. They hadn't heard gunshots, but their house was far enough from the crime scene, and the night had been filled with fireworks and celebration that could have masked the sound. The physical evidence was processed with the tools available in 1985. The boot prints were photographed from multiple angles and measured carefully. The pattern suggested a common style of winter boot, the kind sold in any sporting goods store or department store throughout Wisconsin. The size indicated someone of average build, neither particularly large nor small. Beyond that, there wasn't much that could be determined without more advanced forensic techniques that wouldn't become available for years. The bullets recovered from Yvonne's body were sent to a ballistics lab. They were small caliber, either .22 or .25, the kind of ammunition used in handguns designed for personal defense rather than hunting or sport shooting. Such weapons were common in rural Wisconsin, where many residents kept firearms for protection or pest control. Tracing the specific gun would require finding it first, and searches of the area around the crime scene turned up nothing. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood extensively, knocking on every door within several blocks of the crime scene. Had anyone heard gunshots? Had anyone seen someone walking in the area between 10 p.m. and midnight? The responses were uniformly disappointing. New Year's Eve had been loud with fireworks, firecrackers, and celebration. Several residents reported hearing bangs or pops, but had assumed they were part of the festivities. No one had looked outside to investigate. No one had seen anything suspicious. The motive question. As the investigation progressed through early January, Detective Keller and his team began focusing on motive. This hadn't been a robbery. Yvonne's coat pockets contained a small amount of cash that hadn't been taken. It hadn't been a sexual assault. There were no signs of that kind of attack. This appeared to be a targeted killing, someone who wanted Yvonne dead specifically. The most obvious area to investigate was Yvonne's personal relationships. In homicide investigations, especially those involving women, romantic entanglements are often central. Keller began looking closely at Jack Owen and at the complicated dynamics of his relationships with both Yvonne and Mary Jo Bailey. Owen was interviewed multiple times in the first week of January. He was cooperative but clearly uncomfortable, a man caught in a situation that had spiraled into tragedy. He confirmed he'd been in relationships with both women and acknowledged the awkwardness of the arrangement. He described Yvonne as kind and easygoing, someone who hadn't pushed him to formalize their relationship or demand exclusivity. He characterized his relationship with Bailey as longer-standing but similarly casual. When asked about his whereabouts on New Year's Eve, Owen had an airtight alibi. He'd been hosting a party attended by 24 people. He'd been visible and present throughout the evening. Multiple guests confirmed he'd been there when the clock struck midnight, still at his own house, surrounded by witnesses. Unless he'd somehow slipped out, committed a murder, and returned without anyone noticing. a scenario investigators considered and quickly dismissed as implausible. He couldn't have killed Yvonne. That left the question of whether someone else might have killed Yvonne on Owen's behalf or because of their connection to him. This brought investigators to Mary Jo Bailey. Bailey was 42 years old in 1985, a lifelong resident of the St. Croix Falls area. She worked in clerical positions at local businesses, lived alone in a small rental house, and was described by those who knew her as quiet and private. She wasn't part of the town's social center, didn't attend church regularly, or participate in community events. She maintained a small circle of acquaintances, but no close friends that investigators could identify. When detectives first interviewed Bailey on January 3, 1986, she presented as calm and composed. She acknowledged knowing Jack Owen and having been in a relationship with him. She confirmed she knew of Yvonne Menke, though she claimed they'd never met personally. When asked about her feelings regarding Jack's relationship with Yvonne, Bailey said she was disappointed but not angry. She characterized it as Jack's choice to make and said she'd accepted the situation. Critically, when asked about her whereabouts on New Year's Eve, Bailey stated she had been home alone. She hadn't attended Jack's party because she didn't feel like going out in the cold. She'd watched television, gone to bed before midnight, and learned about Yvonne's death the next day from a neighbor who'd heard the news. Detectives asked if anyone could verify her alibi. Bailey said no. She lived alone and hadn't spoken to anyone that evening. She hadn't made or received phone calls, at least none she could remember. She couldn't prove where she'd been, but she pointed out that not having an alibi didn't make her guilty. Plenty of people spent New Year's Eve alone. The interview ended without dramatic revelations. Bailey hadn't confessed, hadn't acted suspiciously nervous, hadn't contradicted herself. She'd simply stated her version of events and left it at that. But something about the interview bothered Keller. It wasn't anything Bailey said specifically, it was what she didn't say. She didn't express shock or grief about Yvonne's death. She didn't ask questions about the investigation or offer theories about who might have done it. She showed no curiosity, no emotional reaction. It was as if the murder was something that had happened to someone else, in some other town, with no connection to her life. Keller made a note in his case file. Bailey remains a person of interest. No alibi. Possible motive, jealousy/romantic rivalry. Demeanor concerning. Too calm, too detached. Over the following weeks, investigators continued building their case. They interviewed Bailey 2 more times, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies. They found none. Her story never changed. Home alone, watching television, knew nothing about the murder. They investigated other potential suspects as well. They looked at ex-boyfriends of Yvonne's, at neighbors who might have had grievances, at anyone with a connection to the victim or the crime scene. Every lead ended in a dead end. Everyone had alibis or no clear motive. The physical evidence, the boot prints, the bullets, pointed to no one specifically. By February 1986, the investigation had stalled. Keller and his team had worked hundreds of hours, interviewed dozens of people, and followed every lead they could identify. But they had no murder weapon, no definitive forensic evidence, and no witness who could place Bailey or anyone else at the crime scene. The case remained open but inactive, filed in boxes that would sit in the sheriff's office for decades. The cold years. For Yvonne Menke's children, life continued in the shadow of unresolved tragedy. The oldest, who had been preparing for high school, now carried the weight of being the responsible sibling, helping to hold the family together. Extended family stepped in to provide support, but nothing could replace their mother or answer the fundamental question that haunted them: who had killed her and why? They grew up in a town where everyone knew their story. Teachers handled them gently, classmates whispered, neighbors offered sympathy that felt both genuine and suffocating. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone was marked by Yvonne's absence. When they graduated high school, started careers, got married, had children of their own, they did so knowing their mother should have been there to witness it. The case became part of St. Croix Falls' collective memory, one of those events that defined a community's history. Older residents would reference it when discussing crime or safety. Things changed after the Menke murder. New residents would hear the story and look at certain streets differently, imagining what had happened there. Mary Jo Bailey continued living in the area. She changed jobs a few times, moved between rental properties, and maintained her quiet existence on the periphery of community life. If people whispered about her possible involvement in Yvonne's death, she gave no indication she heard or cared. She never married, never left the region, never did anything that drew attention. Jack Owen eventually moved away, remarried, and started a new life in another part of Wisconsin. He rarely returned to St. Croix Falls, reportedly uncomfortable with the associations the town held for him. Detective Keller retired in the mid-1990s, the Menke case one of the few unsolved homicides that haunted him. In interviews years later, he would say it was the one that got away, the case where he knew in his gut who was responsible but couldn't prove it. The case file sat in storage, occasionally pulled out when a new detective wanted to take a look or when someone called with a tip that inevitably led nowhere. The physical evidence, the photographs, the boot casts, the bullets, remained preserved, waiting for technology or insight that didn't yet exist. For 36 years, that's where things stood. Yvonne Menke's murder was an unsolved cold case, a tragedy without resolution, a question without an answer. And then, in 2021, someone decided to look again. Yvonne Menke's case remained cold for more than 3 decades, her children growing up without answers. But the truth was closer than anyone realized. Subscribe to stay updated on cases where persistence refuses to let justice fade. Now, let's talk about what finally broke this case wide open. By 2021, the Polk County Sheriff's Office looked very different from the agency that had investigated Yvonne Menke's murder in 1986. Personnel had turned over completely, Detective Keller had passed away, and none of the original investigators remained active. The physical office had been renovated and modernized. Computer systems had replaced filing cabinets. Digital photography had replaced film. More importantly, attitudes toward cold cases had evolved. What was once considered an unfortunate reality of limited resources and unsolvable mysteries had become a priority driven by advances in forensic science and a cultural shift toward accountability. Television shows highlighting cold case successes, DNA databases that could link evidence across decades, and improved forensic techniques all contributed to a renewed belief that old cases could be solved. In Wisconsin, as in many states, law enforcement agencies began systematically reviewing their cold case files, dedicating resources specifically to revisiting unsolved homicides. The Polk County Sheriff's Office was no exception. In early 2021, they assembled a small cold case team and began pulling boxes from storage, prioritizing cases that had strong circumstantial evidence but had stalled due to technological limitations of their era. The Yvonne Menke case was near the top of that list. Detective Travis Sturkenbach was assigned as the lead investigator. Sturkenbach was in his late 30s, a 12-year veteran of the department with a reputation for thoroughness and patience. He had never worked a cold case before, but he approached it with the mindset of someone who understood that these investigations required different skills than active cases. You couldn't re-interview witnesses at crime scenes that no longer existed. You couldn't rely on fresh forensic evidence. You had to work with what was preserved and find new ways to interpret it. When Sturkenbach opened the Menke case file in March 2021, he found himself looking at a well-organized but incomplete picture. The original investigators had been thorough by 1985 standards. They had documented witness statements, photographed the crime scene extensively, and preserved physical evidence. But they had also been limited by the technology of their time. Sturkenbach began where all cold case investigations begin, by reading everything. He spent weeks going through witness statements, detective notes, forensic reports, and follow-up memos. He created timelines, mapped out relationships, and built a comprehensive understanding of what had happened on December 31, 1985, and in the weeks that followed. What emerged from this review was a picture of an investigation that had identified a likely suspect, Mary Jo Bailey, but had been unable to gather enough evidence to charge her. The motive was clear: romantic jealousy. The opportunity was present. Bailey had no alibi, and lived within walking distance of the crime scene. But the means and direct evidence were missing. No one had seen her at the scene. No physical evidence definitively linked her to the crime. No witness could place her near Owen's house or on the street where Yvonne was killed. Sturkenbach made a list of what the original investigation had and what it lacked. What they had: clear motive, Bailey's romantic rivalry with Yvonne. Lack of alibi, Bailey claimed to be home alone. Physical evidence, boot prints at scene. Witness statements, multiple people placing Yvonne at party, leaving alone. What they lacked: murder weapon, eyewitness to the shooting. Forensic evidence linking Bailey to scene. Any direct proof of Bailey's involvement. The question facing Sturkenbach was whether advances in forensic analysis, combined with new witness interviews, could fill in the gaps enough to bring charges nearly 4 decades later. Revisiting the physical evidence. Sturkenbach's first step was to have all physical evidence re-examined using modern techniques. The original photographs of the boot prints at the crime scene were digitized and enhanced. Forensic imaging software could now extract details that hadn't been visible to investigators in 1985, when they had relied on physical photographs and manual measurements. A forensic podiatrist, a specialty that barely existed in 1985, was brought in to analyze the prints. The analysis revealed several important details. The boot prints showed a distinctive tread pattern consistent with a brand of winter boots manufactured by a company that was popular in the Midwest during the 1980s. More specifically, the wear pattern on the treads suggested someone who walked with a slightly pronated gait, meaning their foot rolled inward as they walked. The depth and spacing of the prints indicated someone between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 7 inches in height, weighing approximately 130 to 160 pounds. These measurements were consistent with an average-sized woman or a smaller-than-average man. Mary Jo Bailey's driver's license from 1985 listed her as 5 feet 5 inches and 145 pounds. This wasn't definitive proof. Thousands of people in Wisconsin fit that general description, but it was more specific than the original analysis had been able to provide. The boot prints couldn't exclude Bailey, and they were consistent with her physical characteristics. Sturkenbach also had the bullets that had been recovered from Yvonne's body re-examined. Modern ballistics analysis couldn't identify the specific weapon without having it for comparison, but it could provide more detail about the type of gun used. The forensic examiner concluded the weapon was most likely a .22 caliber revolver, a common type of handgun often owned for home defense. The powder burns on Yvonne's coat indicated the shots were fired from less than 3 feet away, suggesting the shooter had approached close before firing. These findings didn't provide new breakthroughs, but they refined the existing evidence, making it more specific and credible for potential use in court. Phone records and digital evidence. One of the advantages Sturkenbach had over the original investigators was access to historical records that had been difficult or impossible to obtain in 1985. In 2021, he could request phone records going back decades, assuming they had been preserved by telecommunications companies. He submitted requests for phone records for both Mary Jo Bailey and Jack Owen covering December 1985 and January 1986. To his satisfaction, the records still existed in archived form. What he discovered was revealing. On December 30th, 1985, the day before Yvonne was killed, Bailey's phone showed multiple outgoing calls to Owen's residence. The calls occurred at 2:45 p.m., 5:30 p.m., and 8:15 p.m. Each call lasted less than 2 minutes, suggesting either brief conversations or calls that went unanswered. On December 31st, the day of the murder, there were 2 more calls from Bailey's phone to Owen's residence, one at 6:45 p.m. and another at 8:30 p.m. The party would have been underway by 8:30, meaning Bailey was calling while knowing Owen was hosting an event she hadn't been invited to, or had chosen not to attend. To Sturkenbach, this pattern suggested someone who was monitoring, checking in, perhaps trying to confirm suspicions or gather information. Why would Bailey be calling Owen multiple times over 2 days, especially on New Year's Eve when she claimed she was staying home alone and hadn't given the party much thought? He also found something in the original case files that hadn't been fully explored. Witness statements from partygoers mentioning that Owen had received phone calls during the party. One guest specifically recalled Owen seeming annoyed by a call, saying something like, "I can't talk now. I told you I have people here." The guest hadn't known who was calling, but combined with the phone records showing Bailey calling at 8:30 p.m., it was reasonable to infer she was the caller. This painted a picture of Bailey not as someone who was unconcerned about Owen's party and Yvonne's presence there, but as someone who was actively engaged, calling repeatedly, perhaps becoming increasingly agitated by Owen's unavailability. Re-interviewing witnesses. With this new context, Sturkenbach began the challenging process of re-interviewing witnesses from 1985. He started by creating a list of everyone who had been at Jack Owen's party, cross-referencing the original statements with current addresses and contact information. Many people had moved away or passed away in the intervening decades. Some declined to be interviewed, citing poor memory or unwillingness to revisit painful events. But enough agreed to talk that Sturkenbach was able to piece together new details. One of the most significant re-interviews was with a woman named Patricia Lundgren, who had attended the party as a neighbor of Owen's. In her original 1986 statement, she had mentioned seeing Yvonne at the party and thought she'd left around 10:30 or 11 p.m. The statement was brief, just a few paragraphs, and hadn't seemed particularly important at the time. When Sturkenbach contacted her in 2022, Patricia was now in her early 70s, retired, and living in a different part of Wisconsin. She agreed to a phone interview, and as they talked, something she had seen that night came back to her with unexpected clarity. She told Sturkenbach that when she'd arrived at the party around 7:30 p.m., she had parked on the street about half a block from Owen's house because the closer spots were taken. As she walked toward the house, she noticed someone standing near a large tree on the opposite side of the street, partially in shadow. The figure was just standing there, not walking, not doing anything obvious. It had struck Patricia as odd at the time. Why would someone be standing outside on one of the coldest nights of the year? But she had dismissed it as perhaps someone smoking a cigarette or waiting for a ride. Now, nearly 40 years later, she told Sturkenbach she believed that figure had been Mary Jo Bailey. She couldn't be absolutely certain. The lighting had been poor, and she hadn't gotten a close look, but something about the build, the posture, and the way the person stood had reminded her of Bailey, whom she knew by sight from around town. Sturkenbach asked why she hadn't mentioned this in her original statement. Patricia explained that the detectives in 1986 had asked specifically about who was at the party, not about who she might have seen outside. The figure standing by the tree hadn't been at the party, so she hadn't thought to mention it. It was only now, with the context of Bailey being a suspect and the specific question about whether she'd seen Bailey anywhere near the area, that the memory surfaced as potentially relevant. This was gold for Sturkenbach. If Patricia's memory was accurate, and he had no reason to doubt her, given that she'd volunteered the information without prompting, it meant Bailey had been outside Owen's house on New Year's Eve, watching, despite her claims of being home alone. He interviewed several other former partygoers, though none provided information as significant as Patricia's. A few recalled seeing Yvonne looking tired or ready to leave, supporting the timeline that she'd left before midnight. One man remembered Owen seeming distracted during the party, taking phone calls in another room, which corroborated the phone records. Sturkenbach also attempted to interview Jack Owen, who was now in his late 70s and living in Milwaukee. Owen initially refused, saying through his attorney that he'd said everything he had to say back in 1986 and didn't want to relive the events. After some negotiation, he agreed to a brief phone conversation. Owen's memory of the party itself was vague. He'd been drinking, and it was nearly 40 years ago, but he confirmed the broad strokes. Yvonne had been there. She'd left alone. He'd stayed at the party. When Sturkenbach asked about Mary Jo Bailey specifically, Owen became more cautious. He acknowledged they'd been involved, but said the relationship had been complicated and probably not healthy for either of us. He wouldn't elaborate on what that meant. When asked if he thought Bailey could have killed Yvonne, Owen was silent for a long moment before saying, "I don't want to accuse anyone of something that serious. But Mary Jo, she could be intense about things. She didn't like sharing. He wouldn't say more. Behavioral analysis and motive with the physical evidence re-examined and witness statements refreshed, Sturkenbach turned to understanding the psychology of the crime. He consulted with a forensic psychologist who specialized in relationship-motivated homicides, particularly those involving female perpetrators. The psychologist reviewed all the case materials and provided a profile that aligned closely with what investigators had suspected since 1986. The murder of Yvonne Menke bore hallmarks of a crime motivated by jealous rage and a desire for elimination of a romantic rival. The choice to shoot Yvonne from behind suggested the killer didn't want a confrontation, didn't want to see Yvonne's face or hear her plead. It was an execution, cold and calculated, designed to remove an obstacle. The fact that it happened on New Year's Eve, when Yvonne was at a party with Jack Owen, suggested the timing was triggered by that specific circumstance. The killer may have been driven to act by the knowledge that Yvonne and Owen were together, celebrating, while the killer was excluded. The psychologist noted that female killers, while less common than male ones, often exhibit different patterns. They're more likely to use poison, less likely to use physical force, and when they do use weapons, they often choose firearms that require less physical strength to operate. A small-caliber handgun fired at close range fit this profile perfectly. Importantly, the psychologist also addressed the question of how someone could kill and then live normally for decades. The answer, she explained, was compartmentalization and rationalization. If the killer believed Yvonne had stolen her relationship, she might have mentally framed the murder as justified retaliation rather than an unjust killing. This would allow her to live without overwhelming guilt, especially if she believed she'd gotten away with it. The profile wasn't evidence in a legal sense, but it reinforced Sturkenbach's conviction that Mary Jo Bailey was responsible for Yvonne's death. The decision to charge by late 2023, Sturkenbach had assembled a comprehensive case file. It included enhanced forensic analysis showing boot prints consistent with Bailey's size and gait, phone records demonstrating Bailey called Owen's house multiple times on December 30th to 31st, suggesting monitoring behavior. Witness testimony from Patricia placing someone resembling Bailey outside Owen's house on the night of the murder. Motive evidence from acquaintances describing Bailey's jealousy and possessiveness regarding Owen. Behavioral profile consistent with a relationship-motivated homicide. Bailey's own statements claiming to be home alone with no alibi. Comments Bailey made after the murder that suggested lack of empathy. At least Jack can move on now. None of these elements individually was sufficient for a conviction, but together they formed what prosecutors call a circumstantial case, one where the accumulation of evidence, though lacking a smoking gun, points convincingly to a single conclusion. Sturkenbach presented his findings to Polk County District Attorney Eric Olson in December 2023. They met in Olson's office, where Sturkenbach laid out everything he'd found over nearly 3 years of investigation. Olson listened carefully, asked pointed questions about the strength of each piece of evidence, and considered the risks of taking a 38-year-old case to trial. The risks were substantial. Witnesses were old, memories were faded, and physical evidence had limitations. Defense attorneys would argue that convicting someone based on events that occurred before many jurors were born was inherently unreliable. They would emphasize that Bailey had never been charged in 1986 despite being a suspect, suggesting the evidence was never strong enough. But Olson also considered the other side. Yvonne Menke's family had waited nearly 4 decades for justice. Advances in forensic science and investigative techniques had provided new insights. If they didn't charge Bailey now, they likely never would. She was 80 years old, and waiting longer only increased the chance she would die before facing accountability. After weeks of consideration, Olson made his decision. They would proceed with charges. He believed a jury could be convinced that Mary Jo Bailey had murdered Yvonne Menke on New Year's Eve 1985, and that she deserved to face trial for that crime. The arrest on March 20th, 2024, Detective Sturkenbach and several other deputies arrived at Mary Jo Bailey's residence in St. Croix Falls. She lived in a small, modest home on the edge of town, the kind of place that blended into the neighborhood without drawing attention. Bailey answered the door wearing casual clothes, her white hair pulled back, her expression one of confusion at seeing multiple law enforcement officers on her doorstep. Sturkenbach identified himself and told her she was under arrest for the first-degree intentional homicide of Yvonne Menke. Bailey's reaction was subdued. She didn't protest loudly, didn't ask what they were talking about, didn't express shock. She simply said, "I want a lawyer," and allowed herself to be handcuffed and led to a patrol car. The arrest made immediate news throughout western Wisconsin and beyond. Local television stations ran segments featuring old photographs of Yvonne, recent images of Bailey being led into the Polk County Courthouse, and interviews with legal experts discussing the unusual nature of charging someone nearly 4 decades after a crime. That Yvonne's children, now in their late 40s and 50s, issued a brief statement through Olson's office. "We have waited our entire adult lives for this day. We are grateful to Detective Sturkenbach and everyone who never stopped working to find justice for our mother. We hope this case shows that time does not erase accountability." Bailey was held at the Polk County Jail on a $250,000 bond, which she was unable to post. She would remain in custody until trial. Pre-trial proceedings, the months between Bailey's arrest and trial, were filled with legal maneuvering. Bailey's attorney, Thomas Vera, a respected criminal defense lawyer from Minneapolis, filed multiple motions seeking to have the charges dismissed or evidence suppressed. Vera argued that prosecuting someone for a crime committed 39 years earlier violated his client's right to a fair trial. Witnesses' memories had faded, potentially exculpatory evidence might have been lost, and Bailey herself was now 81 years old, facing physical and cognitive challenges that made mounting a defense difficult. Judge Molly Rossiter, who would preside over the trial, rejected these arguments. She ruled that while the passage of time created challenges, it didn't make a trial inherently unfair. Both sides faced the same challenges regarding witness memory and evidence preservation. Bailey's age and health, while relevant for sentencing considerations, didn't prevent her from standing trial. Vera also moved to suppress Patricia's testimony about seeing someone resembling Bailey outside Owen's house, arguing it was unreliable identification testimony based on a decades-old memory of a brief sighting in poor lighting. Rossiter partially agreed, ruling that Patricia could testify about seeing someone but would be carefully instructed about the limitations of identification testimony. The jury would have to decide how much weight to give her account. The phone records were also contested. Vera argued they showed only that Bailey called Owen's house, not that she was physically present at the scene of the murder. Rossiter allowed the records to be admitted, ruling that their interpretation was a question for the jury. As May 2024 approached and the trial date neared, both sides prepared for a case that would hinge on circumstantial evidence, witness credibility, and the question of whether a jury could be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Bailey had committed murder nearly 4 decades earlier. For the people of St. Croix Falls, the trial represented something more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning with their community's history, with an unsolved crime that had haunted the town for generations, and with questions about justice, memory, and whether the truth could really emerge after so much time had passed. The answer would come in a courtroom where witnesses would recount events from another era, where photographs from 1985 would be displayed on modern screens, and where 12 jurors would be asked to reach into the past and render judgment on what had happened on one cold New Year's Eve when Yvonne Menke walked home and never arrived. Justice had been delayed for 39 years, but it was finally within reach. Subscribe and share this story to keep cold cases like Yvonne's in the spotlight. Now, the moment everyone had been waiting for. The trial that would finally reveal the full truth. Provided information as significant as Patricia's. A few recalled seeing Yvonne looking tired or ready to leave, supporting the timeline that she'd left before midnight. One man remembered Owen seeming distracted during the party, taking phone calls in another room, which corroborated the phone records. Sturkenbach also attempted to interview Jack Owen, who was now in his late 70s and living in Milwaukee. Owen initially refused, saying through his attorney that he'd said everything he had to say back in 1986 and didn't want to relive the events. After some negotiation, he agreed to a brief phone conversation. Owen's memory of the party itself was vague. He'd been drinking, and it was nearly 40 years ago, but he confirmed the broad strokes. Yvonne had been there. She'd left alone. He'd stayed at the party. When Sturkenbach asked about Mary Jo Bailey specifically, Owen became more cautious. He acknowledged they'd been involved, but said the relationship had been complicated and probably not healthy for either of us. He wouldn't elaborate on what that meant. When asked if he thought Bailey could have killed Yvonne, Owen was silent for a long moment before saying, "I don't want to accuse anyone of something that serious. But Mary Jo, she could be intense about things. She didn't like sharing." He wouldn't say more. Behavioral analysis and motive. With the physical evidence re-examined and witness statements refreshed, Sturkenbach turned to understanding the psychology of the crime. He consulted with a forensic psychologist who specialized in relationship-motivated homicides, particularly those involving female perpetrators. The psychologist reviewed all the case materials and provided a profile that aligned closely with what investigators had suspected since 1986. The murder of Yvonne Menke bore hallmarks of a crime motivated by jealous rage and a desire for elimination of a romantic rival. The choice to shoot Yvonne from behind suggested the killer didn't want a confrontation, didn't want to see Yvonne's face or hear her plead. It was an execution, cold and calculated, designed to remove an obstacle. The fact that it happened on New Year's Eve, when Yvonne was at a party with Jack Owen, suggested the timing was triggered by that specific circumstance. The killer may have been driven to act by the knowledge that Yvonne and Owen were together, celebrating, while the killer was excluded. The psychologist noted that female killers, while less common than male ones, often exhibit different patterns. They're more likely to use poison, less likely to use physical force, and when they do use weapons, they often choose firearms that require less physical strength to operate. A small-caliber handgun fired at close range fit this profile perfectly. Importantly, the psychologist also addressed the question of how someone could kill and then live normally for decades. The answer, she explained, was compartmentalization and rationalization. If the killer believed Yvonne had stolen her relationship, she might have mentally framed the murder as justified retaliation rather than an unjust killing. This would allow her to live without overwhelming guilt, especially if she believed she'd gotten away with it. The profile wasn't evidence in a legal sense, but it reinforced Sturkenbach's conviction that Mary Jo Bailey was responsible for Yvonne's death. The decision to charge. By late 2023, Sturkenbach had assembled a comprehensive case file. It included enhanced forensic analysis showing boot prints consistent with Bailey's size and gait, phone records demonstrating Bailey called Owen's house multiple times on December 30th to 31st, suggesting monitoring behavior. Witness testimony from Patricia placing someone resembling Bailey outside Owen's house on the night of the murder. Motive evidence from acquaintances describing Bailey's jealousy and possessiveness regarding Owen. Behavioral profile consistent with a relationship-motivated homicide. Bailey's own statements claiming to be home alone with no alibi. Comments Bailey made after the murder that suggested lack of empathy. "At least Jack can move on now." None of these elements individually was sufficient for a conviction, but together they formed what prosecutors call a circumstantial case, one where the accumulation of evidence, though lacking a smoking gun, points convincingly to a single conclusion. Sturkenbach presented his findings to Polk County District Attorney Eric Olson in December 2023. They met in Olson's office, where Sturkenbach laid out everything he'd found over nearly 3 years of investigation. Olson listened carefully, asked pointed questions about the strength of each piece of evidence, and considered the risks of taking a 38-year-old case to trial. The risks were substantial. Witnesses were old, memories were faded, and physical evidence had limitations. Defense attorneys would argue that convicting someone based on events that occurred before many jurors were born was inherently unreliable. They would emphasize that Bailey had never been charged in 1986 despite being a suspect, suggesting the evidence was never strong enough. But Olson also considered the other side. Yvonne Menke's family had waited nearly 4 decades for justice. Advances in forensic science and investigative techniques had provided new insights. If they didn't charge Bailey now, they likely never would. She was 80 years old, and waiting longer only increased the chance she would die before facing accountability. After weeks of consideration, Olson made his decision. They would proceed with charges. He believed a jury could be convinced that Mary Jo Bailey had murdered Yvonne Menke on New Year's Eve 1985, and that she deserved to face trial for that crime. The arrest. On March 20th, 2024, Detective Sturkenbach and several other deputies arrived at Mary Jo Bailey's residence in St. Croix Falls. She lived in a small, modest home on the edge of town, the kind of place that blended into the neighborhood without drawing attention. Bailey answered the door wearing casual clothes, her white hair pulled back, her expression one of confusion at seeing multiple law enforcement officers on her doorstep. Sturkenbach identified himself and told her she was under arrest for the first-degree intentional homicide of Yvonne Menke. Bailey's reaction was subdued. She didn't protest loudly, didn't ask what they were talking about, didn't express shock. She simply said, "I want a lawyer," and allowed herself to be handcuffed and led to a patrol car. The arrest made immediate news throughout western Wisconsin and beyond. Local television stations ran segments featuring old photographs of Yvonne, recent images of Bailey being led into the Polk County Courthouse, and interviews with legal experts discussing the unusual nature of charging someone nearly 4 decades after a crime. Yvonne's children, now in their late 40s and 50s, issued a brief statement through Olson's office. "We have waited our entire adult lives for this day. We are grateful to Detective Sturkenbach and everyone who never stopped working to find justice for our mother. We hope this case shows that time does not erase accountability." Bailey was held at the Polk County Jail on a $250,000 bond, which she was unable to post. She would remain in custody until trial. Pre-trial proceedings. The months between Bailey's arrest and trial were filled with legal maneuvering. Bailey's attorney, Thomas Vera, a respected criminal defense lawyer from Minneapolis, filed multiple motions seeking to have the charges dismissed or evidence suppressed. Vera argued that prosecuting someone for a crime committed 39 years earlier violated his client's right to a fair trial. Witnesses' memories had faded, potentially exculpatory evidence might have been lost, and Bailey herself was now 81 years old, facing physical and cognitive challenges that made mounting a defense difficult. Judge Molly Rossiter, who would preside over the trial, rejected these arguments. She ruled that while the passage of time created challenges, it didn't make a trial inherently unfair. Both sides faced the same challenges regarding witness memory and evidence preservation. Bailey's age and health, while relevant for sentencing considerations, didn't prevent her from standing trial. Vera also moved to suppress Patricia's testimony about seeing someone resembling Bailey outside Owen's house, arguing it was unreliable identification testimony based on a decades-old memory of a brief sighting in poor lighting. Rossiter partially agreed, ruling that Patricia could testify about seeing someone but would be carefully instructed about the limitations of identification testimony. The jury would have to decide how much weight to give her account. The phone records were also contested. Vera argued they showed only that Bailey called Owen's house, not that she was physically present at the scene of the murder. Rossiter allowed the records to be admitted, ruling that their interpretation was a question for the jury. As May 2024 approached and the trial date neared, both sides prepared for a case that would hinge on circumstantial evidence, witness credibility, and the question of whether a jury could be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Bailey had committed murder nearly 4 decades earlier. For the people of St. Croix Falls, the trial represented something more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning with their community's history, with an unsolved crime that had haunted the town for generations, and with questions about justice, memory, and whether the truth could really emerge after so much time had passed. The answer would come in a courtroom where witnesses would recount events from another era, where photographs from 1985 would be displayed on modern screens, and where 12 jurors would be asked to reach into the past and render judgment on what had happened on one cold New Year's Eve when Yvonne Menke walked home and never arrived. Justice had been delayed for 39 years, but it was finally within reach. Subscribe and share this story to keep cold cases like Yvonne's in the spotlight. Now, the moment everyone had been waiting for. The trial that would finally reveal the full truth. Act 3. Justice delivered. The trial opens. The trial of Mary Jo Bailey began on May 13, 2024, in the Polk County Circuit Courthouse, a brick building in downtown Balsam Lake that had stood since the early 20th century. The courtroom itself was modest, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights, but on that Monday morning, it was packed beyond capacity. Every seat in the public gallery was filled with Yvonne's family members, local residents, reporters, and true crime enthusiasts who had driven from across the region. Mary Jo Bailey, now 81, entered the courtroom wearing a conservative navy blue dress. Her white hair was neatly styled, and she moved slowly, with visible effort. She sat at the defense table next to her attorney Thomas Vera, her expression blank, showing no emotion as she looked around the crowded room. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Eric Olson organized his files with practiced efficiency. Beside him sat Detective Travis Jerkenbach, who would serve as the prosecution's primary investigative witness. Judge Molly Rossiter entered, and the room rose. After brief preliminary instructions, jury selection began. The process would take 2 full days. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their ability to evaluate a case from 1985, whether they could set aside any preconceptions about cold cases, and whether the defendant's age would inappropriately influence their judgment. By Wednesday morning, a jury of 8 women and 4 men, plus 2 alternates, had been seated. Their ages ranged from late 20s to mid-60s. None had lived in St. Croix Falls in 1985. Most hadn't even been born yet. They would have to imagine a world before cell phones, before DNA databases, before many of the tools that modern Americans took for granted. Opening statements. Eric Olson stood before the jury at 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday, May 15th, and began the prosecution's case with a deliberate, measured tone. On December 31st, 1985, Yvonne Menke kissed her 4 children goodnight and walked to a party just a few blocks from her home. She was 35 years old. She was a mother who worked hard to provide for her family. She was looking forward to celebrating the new year with friends and neighbors. She never made it home. Olson walked the jury through the basic facts: the party at Jack Owen's house, Yvonne's departure alone, the discovery of her body the next morning, the 2 gunshot wounds in her back. He displayed photographs of Yvonne, both in life and in death, forcing the jury to confront the reality of what had been taken. Then he turned to motive. This case is about jealousy. It's about a woman named Mary Jo Bailey who was involved with Jack Owen and who viewed Yvonne Menke as a rival, as an obstacle to the relationship she wanted. We will show you that Mary Jo Bailey called Jack Owen's house multiple times on the day before and the day of Yvonne's murder. We will show you that a witness saw someone resembling Bailey outside Owen's house on the night of the party, watching, waiting. We will show you that Bailey had no alibi, claiming to be home alone, and that the physical evidence at the scene, boot prints in the snow, is consistent with her size and build. Olson acknowledged the challenge ahead. This case is 39 years old. That's a long time. Memories fade, evidence has limitations, and some witnesses have passed away. But the truth doesn't change just because time passes. The evidence, when you look at it all together, points to one person and one person only. Mary Jo Bailey, sitting right there, killed Yvonne Menke because she wanted Jack Owen for herself. Thomas Vera's opening statement was shorter but forceful. He stood and looked directly at the jury, his voice carrying a note of incredulity. The prosecution is asking you to convict an 81-year-old woman of a murder committed 39 years ago based on speculation, on assumptions, and on evidence so thin it wouldn't convict anyone if this crime had happened last year instead of in 1985. They have no murder weapon. They have no DNA. They have no fingerprints. They have no witness who saw Mary Jo Bailey at the scene of this crime. What they have is a theory that my client was jealous and therefore must have committed murder, but a theory is not proof. Vera methodically attacked each piece of the prosecution's case. The phone records? They proved Bailey called Owen's house, nothing more. Millions of people make phone calls without committing murder. The witness who supposedly saw Bailey outside Owen's house. A decades-old memory of seeing someone in the dark from a distance, hardly reliable. The boot prints? Consistent with thousands of people in Wisconsin in 1985. The prosecution will ask you to fill in the gaps in their case with assumptions and speculation. I'm asking you to do what the law requires. Demand proof. Demand evidence. And when you see that the prosecution hasn't met their burden, you will have no choice but to find Mary Jo Bailey not guilty. The prosecution's case, building the foundation. Over the following week, Olson methodically presented his case. He began with witnesses who established the basic facts and humanized Yvonne for the jury. Yvonne's eldest daughter, now 52, testified first. She described her mother as loving and devoted, someone who always put her children first. She recounted December 31st, 1985, in detail, her mother getting ready for the party, telling them she'd be home soon, the growing panic when she didn't return, and the devastating news that followed. Several jurors wiped tears as she spoke. Detective Keller's widow testified about her late husband's work on the case. She brought his old case notes, preserved for decades, which Olson entered into evidence. She described how the unsolved murder had troubled her husband until his death, how he believed he knew who was responsible but couldn't prove it. A former partygoer, now 68, testified about seeing Yvonne at the party. She described Yvonne as having seemed tired but not upset, as having left alone sometime before midnight. She recalled Owen receiving phone calls during the party and seeming annoyed by them. Then came Patricia Lundgren, the witness who had seen someone outside Owen's house. Now 73, Patricia walked to the witness stand with a cane but spoke clearly and confidently. Under Olson's questioning, she described arriving at the party around 7:30 p.m. and seeing a figure standing near a tree across from Owen's house. "Can you describe this person?" Olson asked. "It was dark, and I didn't get a close look," Patricia acknowledged. "But it was someone average height, wearing a dark coat. They were just standing there, watching the house. It struck me as odd. Did you recognize this person?" "I believed at the time, and I still believe, that it was Mary Jo Bailey. I knew her by sight from around town. The build and posture seemed like hers." Vera's cross-examination was aggressive. He pressed Patricia on the lighting conditions, the distance, the fact that she'd acknowledged not getting a close look. He emphasized that 39 years had passed and asked whether she could truly be certain of what she'd seen. Patricia held firm. "I know what I saw. I can't be 100% certain it was Mary Jo Bailey, but I believe it was." The forensic evidence came next. A footwear analyst testified about the boot prints found at the crime scene, explaining how modern enhancement techniques had revealed details not visible in 1985. She displayed side-by-side comparisons showing the tread pattern, the depth, and the gait characteristics, explaining how they were consistent with someone of Bailey's approximate size and build. Vera cross-examined extensively, getting the analyst to acknowledge that consistent with didn't mean definitely from, and that thousands of people could have left similar prints. The ballistics expert testified about the bullets recovered from Yvonne's body, confirming they came from a small-caliber handgun and that the powder burns indicated close-range firing. Olson established that such weapons were commonly owned for personal defense, accessible to anyone, including women. Then came the phone records. A telecommunications analyst walked the jury through the records, showing multiple calls from Bailey's phone to Owen's residence on December 30th and 31st, 1985. Olson asked the analyst to explain what this pattern might suggest. "Objection," Vera said immediately. "Calls for speculation." Sustained, Judge Rossiter ruled. "The witness may describe the pattern but not interpret its meaning. That's for the jury." Olson rephrased. "Can you tell the jury what pattern, if any, you observe in these records?" "There are 5 calls over 2 days, multiple on each day, each lasting less than 2 minutes. That could suggest repeated attempts to reach someone or brief conversations." Olson let the jury draw their own conclusions. The prosecution's case, motive and character. The next phase of the prosecution's case focused on establishing Bailey's motive and state of mind. Olson called several witnesses who had known Bailey in 1985 and could speak to her relationship with Jack Owen and her feelings about Yvonne. A woman who had worked with Bailey at a local insurance office in the early 1980s testified that Bailey had talked about Jack Owen frequently, describing him as someone she'd been seeing on and off for years. When Owen started seeing Yvonne, Bailey's mood had changed. She seemed more irritable, more withdrawn. She mentioned Yvonne a few times, always in a dismissive way, like she wasn't someone who mattered. Under cross-examination, Vera got the witness to acknowledge that being irritable didn't make someone a murderer and that many people complain about romantic rivals without resorting to violence. Another acquaintance testified about a comment Bailey had made a few weeks after Yvonne's murder. They had been discussing the case, and Bailey had said something to the effect of, "Well, at least Jack can move on now." The witness said the comment had struck her as callous at the time, but she hadn't thought it significant enough to report. "Did you interpret this comment as a confession to murder?" Vera asked on cross-examination. "No," the witness admitted. "Just as cold. Inappropriate. People say inappropriate things all the time without being killers, don't they?" "Yes." The forensic psychologist who had consulted on the case testified about patterns in relationship-motivated homicides. She explained how jealousy could escalate to violence, how perpetrators often rationalize their actions, and how the specific details of Yvonne's murder, the close-range shooting from behind, the timing on a night when Yvonne was with Owen, fit patterns seen in crimes motivated by romantic rivalry. Vera's cross-examination was withering. He got the psychologist to acknowledge she had never interviewed Bailey, had never evaluated her personally, and was essentially providing a generic profile that could apply to any number of people. The testimony was theoretical, not specific proof of Bailey's guilt. Jack Owen takes the stand. One of the most anticipated witnesses was Jack Owen himself. Now 78, Owen had been reluctant to testify, but a subpoena had compelled his appearance. He entered the courtroom looking uncomfortable, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair who kept his eyes down as he walked to the witness stand. Under Olson's questioning, Owen confirmed his relationships with both Yvonne and Bailey in 1985. He described them as casual, overlapping, and acknowledged the situation had been messy and probably unfair to both of them. "Did Mary Jo Bailey know about your relationship with Yvonne Menke?" Olson asked. "Yes." "How did she react?" Owen hesitated. "She wasn't happy about it. I think she thought we should be together exclusively. I wasn't ready for that with her or with Yvonne." "Did you receive phone calls from Mary Jo Bailey on New Year's Eve?" "I don't remember specifically, but it's possible. She called sometimes." "Do you recall being annoyed by phone calls during your party?" "Vaguely, yes." Olson paused, letting the jury absorb this. Then, "Mr. Owen, in your opinion, was Mary Jo Bailey capable of killing Yvonne Menke out of jealousy?" Vera objected immediately. Calls for speculation and opinion on the ultimate issue. Judge Rossiter sustained the objection, and Olson moved on. Vera's cross-examination focused on establishing that Owen had no personal knowledge of who killed Yvonne, that he'd been at his party all night, and that his relationships with both women had been his choice, not something either woman had forced on him. Owen left the stand looking relieved to be done, avoiding eye contact with Bailey as he passed the defense table. The defense's case. Thomas Vera's defense strategy was straightforward. He would not put Bailey on the stand, avoiding the risk of cross-examination, and would instead attack the weaknesses in the prosecution's case through cross-examination and a handful of defense witnesses. He called a forensic consultant who testified that boot print analysis, especially from photographs taken 39 years earlier, had significant limitations. The consultant acknowledged the prints were consistent with someone of Bailey's size, but emphasized they were also consistent with countless others. Vera called a memory expert who testified about the unreliability of long-term memory, particularly identifications made in poor lighting and recalled decades later. The expert explained how suggestion and exposure to information over time could contaminate memories, making witnesses genuinely believe they remembered things with more certainty than was justified. He called a statistician who testified about coincidence, about how patterns that seem suspicious in hindsight, phone calls, lack of alibi, opportunity, are actually quite common and don't necessarily indicate guilt. But Vera's most important arguments came during his cross-examinations and in his closing statement, where he would emphasize what the prosecution hadn't proven. Closing arguments. On May 29, 2024, after 2 weeks of testimony, both sides delivered closing arguments. Eric Olson stood before the jury and walked them through the evidence one final time. He asked them to consider not each piece of evidence in isolation, but the total picture they created when viewed together. Mary Jo Bailey called Jack Owen's house 5 times over 2 days. She was seen outside his house on the night Yvonne was there. She had no alibi. The boot prints at the scene were consistent with her size. Yvonne was shot from behind with a small caliber weapon, killed within blocks of Jack Owen's house. Mary Jo Bailey had motive, jealousy of Yvonne. She had opportunity. She was alone that night with no witnesses. And after Yvonne's death, she made comments suggesting she was glad the obstacle to her relationship with Jack was gone. Olson acknowledged the case's age. Yes, this happened 39 years ago. Yes, we don't have a video of the murder. Yes, the defendant didn't confess. But that's why we have juries, to look at the evidence and determine what it proves. And this evidence proves that Mary Jo Bailey murdered Yvonne Menke. Thomas Vera's closing was equally emphatic. He stood before the jury and delivered a point-by-point dismantling of the prosecution's case. Phone calls are not murder. Being seen outside a house, if that's even what happened, is not murder. Not having an alibi is not murder. Boot prints consistent with thousands of people are not murder. The prosecution has asked you to connect dots that shouldn't be connected, to assume that because my client knew Jack Owen and may have been jealous, she must have committed murder. But must have is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury of the burden of proof. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Not probably guilty. Not likely guilty. Beyond a reasonable doubt. And when you look at this case honestly, there are doubts everywhere. You cannot convict based on doubts. The verdict. The jury began deliberations on May 30th at 10 a.m. They would deliberate for 9 hours total, split over 2 days. Inside the jury room, they carefully reviewed evidence, reread testimony transcripts, and debated what the accumulation of circumstantial evidence meant. According to later interviews with jurors, who spoke anonymously to media, the deliberations were thorough but not contentious. Most jurors felt the prosecution had proven its case, but they wanted to carefully consider every piece of evidence and address any doubts before reaching a verdict. The boot prints, the phone records, Patricia's testimony, Bailey's comments after the murder. Individually, each could be explained away. But together, they formed a pattern that the majority of jurors found convincing. The jealousy motive made sense. The lack of alibi was suspicious. The timing and location of the murder pointed to someone who knew Yvonne's movements and had access to the area. On May 30th at 7:15 p.m., the jury sent word they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Yvonne's children sat in the front row, holding hands. Bailey sat expressionless at the defense table. Judge Rossiter asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of first-degree intentional homicide, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Mary Jo Bailey, guilty." The courtroom erupted in muted reactions. Yvonne's daughters embraced, tears streaming. Some spectators exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath for decades. Bailey showed no visible reaction, staring straight ahead as her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder. Judge Rossiter thanked the jury and set sentencing for July 2, 2024. The sentencing. 2 months later, on a warm summer morning, Mary Jo Bailey returned to court to learn her sentence. Wisconsin law mandated life in prison for first-degree intentional homicide. The only question was eligibility for parole. Before sentencing, Yvonne's family was given the opportunity for victim impact statements. Her 3 daughters and 1 son, now in their late 40s and 50s, each spoke. Her eldest daughter went first. "My mother was 35 when she died. I'm now 52. I've lived 17 years longer than she did. Every milestone in my life, my graduation, my wedding, the birth of my children, happened without her. You took that from us, Ms. Bailey. You took our mother, and you never showed an ounce of remorse." Her son spoke next. "I was 8 years old when my mom was murdered. I barely remember her voice now. I had to grow up with an empty space where she should have been. You did that. You chose to do that." Each statement was delivered with controlled emotion, powerful in its restraint. Bailey was asked if she wished to speak. Through her attorney, she declined and maintained her innocence, indicating she would appeal. Judge Rossiter then delivered her sentence. She spoke for several minutes, summarizing the crime, acknowledging the unusual nature of the case's age, and emphasizing the seriousness of taking a life. "Mary Jo Bailey, you were convicted by a jury of your peers of first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Yvonne Menke. The evidence showed you waited for Ms. Menke, shot her twice in the back, and left her to die in the snow. You then lived your life for 39 years while her family lived without answers. The sentence is life in prison with eligibility for parole after 20 years. At 81, with parole eligibility at 101, it was effectively a life sentence." Bailey was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. She would be transferred to a Wisconsin women's correctional facility, where she would remain until her death. Understanding what happened. In the weeks following sentencing, investigators, journalists, and observers tried to piece together what had actually happened on December 31, 1985. While Bailey never confessed, the evidence presented at trial allowed for a reconstruction. Most likely, Mary Jo Bailey spent December 31st consumed by thoughts of Jack Owen's party and Yvonne's presence there. The phone calls showed she was monitoring the situation, perhaps hoping to confirm that Yvonne wouldn't attend or trying to convince Owen to disinvite her. When those calls didn't produce the results she wanted, Bailey likely drove or walked to Owen's house to see for herself. Patricia's testimony placed someone resembling Bailey outside the house, watching. Bailey would have seen people arriving, seen through windows that the party was underway, perhaps even spotted Yvonne inside. She may have waited there for hours, in the cold, watching and growing increasingly agitated. When Yvonne left the party alone and began walking home, Bailey saw her opportunity. She likely followed Yvonne at a distance, then approached from behind when they were on a dark, quiet stretch of street. She may have called Yvonne's name, causing her to turn or slow down. Then, from less than 3 feet away, she fired twice. The choice of weapon, a small handgun, and the approach from behind suggested Bailey wanted to avoid confrontation. She wasn't physically capable of overpowering Yvonne in a struggle, but she didn't need to be. The gun equalized the power dynamic. After shooting Yvonne, Bailey likely returned to her own home, disposed of the weapon, which was never found, and tried to create the appearance of normalcy. When questioned by police, she stuck to her story. Home alone, knew nothing. For 39 years, that story held. But ultimately, the accumulated weight of evidence, combined with dedicated investigators who refused to let the case die, brought accountability. The aftermath. The resolution of Yvonne Menke's murder sent ripples through St. Croix Falls and beyond. For the local community, it was a mixture of closure and reopened trauma. Residents who had lived through 1985 found themselves revisiting those days, remembering their own connections to the case. For the Polk County Sheriff's Office, it validated their cold case program and demonstrated the value of applying new techniques to old evidence. Detective Sturkenbach received commendations and was promoted. The case became a template for how to approach other cold cases in the county's files. For Yvonne's family, the verdict brought something they described not as closure, but as acknowledgement. One daughter told reporters, "We always knew someone killed our mom. Now the world knows who it was. That's not closure. She's still gone, but it's justice." The family held a private memorial service in September 2024, nearly 39 years after Yvonne's death. They gathered at the cemetery where she was buried, planted flowers, and shared memories. For the first time in decades, they could remember her without the shadow of an unsolved mystery hanging over her name. They also established the Yvonne Menke Memorial Scholarship for single mothers pursuing education in Polk County, a way to honor her legacy by helping others in circumstances similar to hers. Reflections on justice. The Bailey case raised important questions about justice, memory, and the limits of the legal system. Legal scholars noted it as an example of how circumstantial evidence, when properly accumulated and presented, can support a conviction even in cases decades old. Critics questioned whether a fair trial was possible so long after a crime, whether witnesses' memories could be trusted, and whether it was just to imprison someone in their 80s for actions committed in their 40s. Supporters argued that Yvonne Menke's age when she died, 35, was far younger than Bailey's current age, and that the passage of time shouldn't erase accountability. They pointed to advances in forensic science that made cases like this solvable in ways they hadn't been originally. Detective Sturkenbach, in an interview after the sentencing, reflected on what the case taught him. Cold cases are only unsolved until someone decides to solve them. Every file has threads that can be pulled. Sometimes it takes new technology. Sometimes it takes asking questions that weren't asked before. Sometimes it just takes refusing to give up. Cases like Yvonne Menke's prove that time doesn't erase truth. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe and share to keep cold cases in the spotlight. Every view could be the one that brings a new lead. The final image. On December 31st, 2024, exactly 39 years after Yvonne Menke's murder, her daughter stood at the memorial marker placed near the site where her mother had been found. It was a cold evening, much like that long-ago night, with snow covering the ground and muffling the sounds of the town. She placed fresh flowers at the base of the marker, a simple granite stone with her mother's name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Mother, forever remembered." Behind her, St. Croix Falls continued its quiet existence. Lights glowed in windows. Families gathered for New Year's celebrations. Life moved forward as it always did. But here, in this spot, time had stopped on December 31st, 1985, and then restarted on May 30th, 2024, when a jury said, "We believe, we know, we will hold someone accountable." Yvonne's daughter stood in the snow for several minutes, thinking about her mother's final moments, about the decades of uncertainty that followed, and about the justice that had finally come. She thought about Mary Jo Bailey, now confined to a prison cell for the rest of her life, paying for a decision made in jealousy and rage nearly 40 years earlier. Justice, she reflected, wasn't always swift. Sometimes it moved slowly, grinding forward like winter itself, cold and inevitable. But it came. She turned and walked back to her car, her footsteps leaving prints in the fresh snow. Unlike her mother's last walk, this one ended safely. She reached her vehicle, started the engine, and drove home through the quiet streets of St. Croix Falls. Behind her, the snow continued to fall, covering her footprints, covering the street, covering the memorial marker. But underneath that snow, the truth remained, permanent and unchangeable. Yvonne Menke had been murdered on New Year's Eve 1985 by Mary Jo Bailey. That truth had taken 39 years to be officially recognized, but it had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. And now, finally, it was known. Some footprints, it turns out, can never truly be erased. Some truths, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually surface. And some families, no matter how long they wait, will finally hear the words they've needed for decades. We found her killer. Justice has been served. Your mother's story has been told. The snow fell. The year turned. And Yvonne Menke's memory, no longer defined by mystery, but by resolution, lived on. Yvonne Menke waited 39 years for justice, but her family never stopped believing the truth would surface. Mary Jo Bailey is now serving life in prison, a reminder that time doesn't erase accountability. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I cover cases where families refuse to give up and investigators refuse to let killers hide in plain sight. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and your suggestion could be the next deep dive on this channel. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime told with respect and thoroughness. Every share helps bring attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth always has a way of surfacing, even after decades in the cold.